The stranger with a kind heart. The snow fell softly over the quiet town of Brighton Hills, blanketing the streets in a pristine, frosty glow. Christmas was only a week away, and the small community buzzed with festive preparations. Children sledded down the gentle hills, their laughter carried on the icy breeze. Families decorated their homes with twinkling lights, wreaths, and ornaments, each display more elaborate than the next. At the edge of this picturesque town stood a modest house, dwarfed by the grand displays of its neighbors. The home belonged to Jacob Daniels, a man in his early 60s with a wiry frame and a kind but weathered face. His eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen life's harshest sides, but still clung to hope. Jacob had lived alone for years, his days a quiet routine of morning walks, volunteer work at the library, and tending his small garden, even in winter. On this crisp December morning, Jacob stood on his porch, carefully unwinding a strand of lights to hang along his roof. They weren't fancy, just simple warm bulbs that cast a soft glow when lit. His breath fogged in the cold air as he worked, his hands steady despite the chill. He glanced down the street, where children played in the snow and neighbors chatted over mugs of steaming coffee. Jacob offered a polite nod to anyone who caught his eye, but most looked away or hurried past. "Strange old man," he heard someone whisper as they walked by. Jacob sighed but didn't react. He wasn't a stranger to such remarks. In a town as small as Brighton Hills, being a private person often drew suspicion. Jacob had always been kind to his neighbors, but his quiet nature and solitary life made him an easy target for gossip. Later that day, Jacob strolled through Main Street, bundled in his worn but sturdy coat. The holiday decorations downtown were extravagant, with wreaths hanging from lampposts and colorful lights crisscrossing above the street. A large Christmas tree stood in the center of the square, its ornaments shimmering in the afternoon sun. As Jacob passed by the town's small homeless shelter, he noticed a group of children huddled together on the icy steps. They were wrapped in mismatched coats and scarves, their faces pale and their eyes dull with exhaustion. Jacob paused, his heart aching at the sight. There were 9 of them, ranging in age from perhaps 4 to 10. They sat close together for warmth, their small bodies trembling in the cold. An older boy tried to shield a little girl from the wind with his arm, while another child clutched a worn teddy bear. Jacob recognized their faces. They were the same children he'd seen around town, scavenging for food or sitting quietly in the corner of the library where he volunteered. Compelled by an urge he couldn't ignore, Jacob approached them slowly. "Hello, kids," he said gently, his voice soft and warm. The children froze, their wide eyes fixed on him. The older boy shifted slightly, placing himself between Jacob and the younger ones. "I'm not here to hurt you," Jacob assured them, crouching to their level. "I just want to help. You all look cold and hungry." The children exchanged wary glances but didn't respond. Jacob noticed how thin they were, their cheeks hollow and their hands red and chapped from the cold. He felt a pang of anger, not at them, but at the world that had failed them. "I live just a few blocks away," he continued, his voice steady despite the lump forming in his throat. "It's warm, and I've got food to share. Maybe you could join me for Christmas. We could make cookies, decorate a tree." One of the older girls, perhaps 10 years old, stepped forward. Her dark eyes were sharp and distrustful, but there was a flicker of curiosity in them. "Why?" she asked bluntly. "Why would you want us to come?" Jacob met her gaze, understanding the skepticism in her voice. "Because no one deserves to spend Christmas in the cold," he said simply. "And because I believe kindness can make a difference." The girl hesitated, glancing back at the others. They were silent, their small faces filled with uncertainty. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. Relief washed over Jacob, though he kept his expression calm. "Good," he said with a gentle smile. "Let's get you all somewhere warm." The walk back to Jacob's house was slow and cautious. The children kept their distance, trailing a few steps behind him. He noticed the way they whispered to one another, their eyes darting around as if expecting danger at every turn. When they reached Jacob's house, the children paused on the sidewalk, staring at the modest home with its simple Christmas lights and neatly shoveled driveway. Jacob opened the door and stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. "It's okay," he said softly. "Come on in." One by one, they shuffled inside, their movements hesitant. The warmth of the house enveloped them, and Jacob watched as their stiff postures began to relax. He led them to the living room, where a small tree stood in the corner, adorned with a few handmade ornaments and a single strand of lights. "Make yourselves comfortable," he said, motioning to the couch and chairs. "I'll fix us something to eat." In the kitchen, Jacob prepared bowls of steaming soup and slices of fresh bread. As he worked, he couldn't help but overhear snippets of the children's whispered conversation. "Do you think it's safe?" one boy asked nervously. "I don't know," the older girl replied. "But it's warm, and he seems okay." Jacob's heart ached at their words. He couldn't imagine the kind of life that had made them so wary of kindness. He brought the food into the living room, setting it on the coffee table. "Eat as much as you'd like," he said with a smile. "There's plenty." The children hesitated for a moment before reaching for the bowls. They ate quickly but carefully, as if afraid the food might be taken away. Jacob sat nearby, watching them with a mix of sadness and hope. As the afternoon turned into evening, the children began to open up, their laughter filling the once quiet house. They played with the old board games Jacob had kept from his teaching days, their faces lighting up with joy. Even the older girl, who introduced herself as Mia, started to smile. For the first time in years, Jacob's house felt alive. The walls seemed to hum with warmth, and the faint sound of Christmas music from the radio added to the cozy atmosphere. But outside, the neighbors watched with growing suspicion. Curtains twitched, and whispers spread like wildfire. Why was Jacob Daniels, the quiet loner, suddenly taking in a group of homeless children? Rumors began to circulate, each one more outlandish than the last. Unaware of the storm brewing around him, Jacob focused on the children, determined to give them a Christmas they would never forget. A town divided. The next morning, Jacob woke early, as was his habit. The house was unusually quiet, save for the soft breathing of the children still asleep on makeshift beds in the living room. Thin rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over their small, peaceful faces. Jacob stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them. The sight filled him with a strange mixture of joy and sadness. It was a joy to see them safe and warm, but sadness clung to him when he thought about how fleeting this peace might be. He stepped quietly into the kitchen, careful not to wake anyone. He brewed a pot of coffee, its rich aroma filling the air, and began preparing breakfast. Pancakes seemed like a good idea, something comforting, something that would make the children feel cared for. As the batter sizzled on the griddle, Jacob's mind wandered. He thought about the whispers he'd heard yesterday. The neighbors had been unusually watchful as he escorted the children into his home. He could almost feel their eyes boring into him, their judgment wrapping around him like a noose. Jacob tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, heavy and suffocating. By the time the children began to stir, breakfast was ready. Jacob greeted them with a warm smile as they shuffled into the kitchen, their eyes still heavy with sleep. "Good morning," he said cheerfully. "I hope you're all hungry." The children hesitated for a moment, their eyes darting between Jacob and the plates of pancakes stacked high on the table. It was Mia, the oldest, who stepped forward first. She pulled out a chair and sat down, gesturing for the others to do the same. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying the hint of gratitude that made Jacob's heart ache. They ate in relative silence, the only sounds the clinking of forks against plates and the occasional murmur of approval. Jacob watched as they devoured the food, noting how some of them tried to save a portion, tucking slices of pancake into their napkins. He didn't say anything, he understood. Survival had taught them habits that would take time to unlearn. When breakfast was finished, Jacob suggested a walk to the park. The children seemed hesitant at first, but the promise of fresh air and open space eventually won them over. They'd bundled up in the warmest clothes Jacob could find in his closet and set off together. Brighton Hills Park was beautiful in the winter, its paths lined with snow-dusted trees and benches. The children ran ahead, their laughter ringing out as they chased one another through the snow. Jacob trailed behind, content to watch them play. But as they reached the edge of the park, Jacob noticed a group of townspeople gathered near the entrance. They weren't there for a casual stroll or to enjoy the scenery. No, their focus was squarely on Jacob and the children. "Isn't that Jacob Daniels?" One woman whispered loudly enough for Jacob to hear. "What's he doing with all those kids?" Another man frowned, crossing his arms. "I don't like it. He's always been strange, keeping to himself. Now this." Jacob felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He tried to keep walking, ushering the children ahead, but the murmurs followed him like a shadow. He could feel their eyes, heavy with suspicion, and it took everything in him to remain calm. When they returned home, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He busied himself in the kitchen, preparing a simple lunch while the children played in the living room. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the park, to the whispers and pointed fingers. The first knock came just after noon. Jacob froze, his heart pounding. He wiped his hands on a towel and went to the door, opening it cautiously. Standing on his porch was Mrs. Jenkins, one of his more vocal neighbors, flanked by two others he didn't recognize. "Hello, Jacob," Mrs. Jenkins said, her tone sharp and clipped. "We've noticed the children you've taken in. Can you explain what's going on?" Jacob frowned, his grip tightening on the doorframe. "I'm just helping them," he said, his voice steady but firm. "They needed a place to stay." Mrs. Jenkins exchanged a glance with the man beside her. "And you don't think it's strange? A man living alone, suddenly bringing in a group of children." "They're homeless," Jacob replied, his tone hardening. "It's Christmas. What would you have me do? Leave them out in the cold?" The man cleared his throat, stepping forward. "We just want to make sure everything's proper. Have you contacted anyone? Child services, maybe?" Jacob's jaw tightened. He knew what they were implying, and it stung more than he cared to admit. "I've done nothing wrong," he said firmly. "If you're concerned, you're welcome to call them yourselves." Mrs. Jenkins looked taken aback by his directness but recovered quickly. "We'll do just that," she said, her voice icy. "For the children's sake." Jacob closed the door before she could say more, his hands trembling with anger. He leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths to calm himself. He had known there would be whispers, but he hadn't expected them to escalate so quickly. That evening, Jacob tried to keep the mood light for the children. They decorated cookies in the kitchen, their laughter filling the air as they smeared frosting and sprinkles on the soft, warm treats. For a while, Jacob managed to forget the weight pressing down on him. Seeing the joy on their faces made it all worthwhile. But outside, the storm was brewing. Word spread quickly through Brighton Hills. Some neighbors voiced their support for Jacob, recalling the kindness he had shown over the years. But others weren't so forgiving. The whispers turned into accusations, and soon enough, the local news caught wind of the story. The first report aired that night. "Concern is growing in Brighton Hills," the anchor began, her tone grave. "A local man, known for his reclusive behavior, has recently taken in 9 homeless children. While some see his actions as an act of charity, others are questioning his motives. Our reporter, Lisa Thompson, has more." The screen cut to Lisa, standing outside Jacob's home with a microphone in hand. Behind her, the house looked small and unassuming, its warm Christmas lights casting a soft glow. "Neighbors have raised questions about Jacob Daniels' intentions," Lisa said. "They claim he has no prior connection to the children and has not contacted authorities to ensure their safety. While there is no evidence of wrongdoing, the situation has left many uneasy." The report ended with a shot of Jacob's house, zooming in on the closed curtains of his living room window. It was meant to look ominous, a calculated move to stir doubt. Inside, Jacob sat in the living room with the children, oblivious to the news report. Mia was reading a storybook aloud, her voice clear and confident as the younger ones listened intently. Jacob watched them, a soft smile on his face. For a moment, he felt at peace, but peace wouldn't last long. The next morning, the knocks on the door came more frequently. Reporters, curious neighbors, even someone from a local charity. Everyone wanted answers. Jacob tried his best to keep the children shielded, but the tension was palpable. By midday, a letter arrived. It was from Child Services. Jacob read it carefully, his hands trembling. They wanted to visit the house to assess the situation. It wasn't an accusation, not yet, but Jacob knew how these things worked. The mere suggestion of impropriety could be enough to ruin him. He looked at the children, who were now sitting around the dining table, drawing pictures with crayons he'd found in an old box. They were finally starting to relax, to feel safe. Jacob couldn't let anything take that away from them. But the storm outside was growing, and Jacob knew it was only a matter of time before it reached his door. The cost of kindness. The next morning, the town of Brighton Hills seemed colder than usual, not just from the snow that had fallen overnight, but from the sharpness in the air, the weight of suspicion that hung over Jacob Daniels' modest home. The whispers had grown into shouts, and the soft glow of Jacob's Christmas lights no longer seemed to evoke warmth. Instead, to many, they were a beacon of something dark and mysterious, a story that was unraveling too quickly for comfort. Inside, Jacob was attempting to shield the children from the outside world. The windows were curtained, and the TV remained off. He knew better than to let them see the news. The letter from Child Services sat on the kitchen counter, its official tone echoing in his mind. They would arrive tomorrow, it said, to evaluate the situation. It was a standard procedure, the letter claimed, but Jacob knew better. This was no routine visit. He tried to focus on the present. The children were playing in the living room, their laughter filling the house with a kind of joy it hadn't known in years. Tanya, the youngest, was carefully stacking blocks, while Marcus and Kevin raced toy cars across the floor. Mia, as always, watched over them like a hawk, her sharp eyes flicking toward Jacob whenever he moved. Jacob walked into the room carrying a tray of cocoa, the mugs steaming and topped with tiny marshmallows. "Time for a break," he said with a smile, setting the tray on the coffee table. The children gathered eagerly, their small hands reaching for the warm mugs. "Thank you, Mr. Daniels," Maya said quietly, her tone carrying a weight beyond her years. She had taken on so much responsibility for her siblings and the other children that Jacob often forgot she was only 10. "You can call me Jacob," he reminded her gently. "And you don't have to thank me for something as simple as cocoa." Mia gave a small nod but didn't respond. She was always guarded, always thinking 2 steps ahead. Jacob respected her caution, even if it saddened him. The calm inside was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. By midday, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk across the street, their murmurs loud enough to reach Jacob's ears. He tried to ignore them, but the knot in his stomach tightened with each passing hour. Why doesn't he just explain himself? A woman's voice carried through the icy air. "He's hiding something," another replied. "No one just takes in 9 kids like that out of the goodness of their heart." Jacob stood by the window, peeking through the curtains. He recognized some of the faces: Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Thompson, and even Lisa Thompson, the reporter who had turned his act of kindness into a headline of suspicion. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made Jacob's heart skip a beat. He turned to see a black sedan parked behind his old pickup truck. A man and a woman stepped out, both wearing heavy coats and carrying folders. Child Services. Jacob inhaled deeply, steadying himself. "Mia," he called softly, and she looked up from her spot on the floor. "Can you help me keep the little ones calm? I need to speak with some people." Mia's eyes narrowed, her mistrust evident, but she nodded. "Okay," she said. "I'll keep them busy." Jacob opened the front door just as the man and woman reached it. The woman smiled politely, though it didn't reach her eyes. The man looked stern, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Daniels?" the woman asked. Jacob nodded. "That's me. You must be from Child Services." "Yes," she replied, extending a hand. "I'm Laura Harris, and this is my colleague, Richard Moore. We're here to follow up on a report." Jacob's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Of course. Please, come in." Inside, Laura and Richard surveyed the living room, their eyes lingering on the children. Mia had corralled the younger ones into a corner where they were coloring on large sheets of paper. Tanya waved at the visitors, her innocence undeterred by the tension in the room. "They're beautiful children," Laura said, her tone carefully neutral. "How did you come to care for them, Mr. Daniels?" Jacob hesitated. He knew this was a delicate moment. "I found them outside the shelter," he explained. "They had nowhere to go, and it was freezing. I couldn't just leave them there." "And you didn't think to contact the authorities?" Richard asked, his voice carrying an edge of suspicion. "I thought about it," Jacob admitted. "But it was late, and I didn't know what would happen to them if I did. I've seen what happens in some shelters. These kids deserve better." Richard made a note in his folder, his expression giving nothing away. "Do you have any experience with children, Mr. Daniels?" "I was a teacher," Jacob replied. "For over 30 years. I retired 5 years ago." "And you live alone?" Laura asked. "Yes." Laura and Richard exchanged a glance, and Jacob felt his defenses rising. He knew how this looked. A single man living alone, suddenly taking in a group of children. But he also knew the truth. His intentions were pure. "Can we speak with the children?" Laura asked. Jacob nodded reluctantly. "Of course. But please, don't scare them. They've been through enough." Laura and Richard spoke with the children one by one, their questions gentle but probing. Jacob stayed in the kitchen, pacing as he waited. He could hear snippets of their conversations. Tanya's cheerful chatter, Marcus's shy responses, Mia's guarded but intelligent answers. When they were finished, Laura and Richard returned to the kitchen. "The children seem to like you," Laura said. "They spoke highly of you." Jacob felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. "We'll need to follow up," Richard added. "There are protocols we have to follow. Background checks, home evaluations. You understand." Jacob nodded, his chest tight. "I understand." As they left, Laura paused at the door. "You seem like a good man, Mr. Daniels," she said quietly. "But good intentions aren't always enough." Jacob closed the door behind them, leaning heavily against it. He felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. He had done nothing wrong, but he knew the court of public opinion didn't operate on truth. It thrived on fear and suspicion. The next morning, the storm outside grew fiercer. The crowd on the sidewalk had doubled, and reporters now mingled with the neighbors. Cameras flashed as Jacob peeked through the curtains, and he felt his pulse quicken. He had become a spectacle, a man whose kindness had turned him into a target. Inside, the children sensed the tension. Mia, ever perceptive, approached Jacob as he stood by the window. "What's going to happen to us?" she asked, her voice small. Jacob turned to her, his heart breaking at the fear in her eyes. "I won't let anything happen to you," he promised. "You're safe here." Mia studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Okay," she said. "I believe you." But as the day wore on, Jacob began to doubt himself. Could he really protect these children from a world that seemed determined to tear them apart? Would his kindness be enough to withstand the judgment of a town that refused to see the good in his actions? As night fell, Jacob sat alone in the living room, the children asleep on their makeshift beds. He stared at the twinkling lights on the Christmas tree, their glow both comforting and bittersweet. He had done the right thing. He knew that in his heart. But sometimes, doing the right thing came at a cost. The weight of the world. The next morning began with an eerie quiet. Outside, the street lay blanketed in snow, the pristine white marred only by footprints from the growing number of onlookers who had started treating Jacob Daniels' home like a spectacle. Across the road, a handful of neighbors huddled together, whispering, their glances darting toward Jacob's house. Cameras flashed intermittently as reporters braved the cold to capture the latest scene in what was quickly becoming a local controversy. Inside, Jacob was trying to keep the children calm. Breakfast was simple, oatmeal and toast, but even that felt like a monumental task under the weight of everything happening outside. The children ate quietly, their usual chatter replaced by a silence that spoke of their unease. Mia sat closest to the window, her eyes darting between her plate and the shadowy figures beyond the curtains. "Are they going to take us away?" Marcus asked, his small voice trembling as he pushed his oatmeal around with his spoon. Jacob crouched down beside him, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "No one is taking you anywhere," he said firmly, though the uncertainty gnawed at him. "You're safe here, I promise." Mia's gaze shifted to Jacob, her sharp eyes searching his face for any cracks in his resolve. "You can't promise that," she said quietly, but not unkindly. Jacob met her gaze, understanding the weight of her words. She was right. There were forces beyond his control now. But he couldn't let her, or any of them, see his doubt. "I'll do everything I can to keep you all safe," he said, his voice steady. "That's a promise I can make." Later that day, the noise outside grew louder. More neighbors had gathered, along with a small army of reporters armed with cameras and microphones. The whispers had turned into accusations, their voices carrying through the crisp winter air. "He's hiding something," a woman said loudly. "Who takes in 9 kids without telling anyone?" Another added. "It's not normal." From his place by the window, Jacob watched as Lisa Thompson, the reporter who had started this frenzy, interviewed Mr. Thompson. The man's arms were crossed, his face stern as he spoke into her microphone. "He's always been odd," Mr. Thompson said, his voice dripping with judgment. "Keeps to himself, doesn't talk to anyone. And now this. 9 kids, just like that. It doesn't sit right with me." Jacob clenched his fists, anger and frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He had lived in Brighton Hills for over 20 years, quietly helping where he could, teaching at the local school, and volunteering at the library. But now, all those years of goodwill seemed to have evaporated overnight, replaced by suspicion and fear. By afternoon, the situation took a turn. A knock at the door startled Jacob, and his heart sank when he saw the uniformed officers standing on his porch. He opened the door cautiously, his face calm despite the storm raging inside him. "Mr. Daniels," one of the officers began, his tone professional but firm. "We've been asked to conduct a welfare check." Jacob stepped aside, his chest tight. "Come in," he said, his voice steady. "The children are in the living room." The officers entered, their eyes scanning the modest home. They found the children sitting around the coffee table, coloring in pages from an old activity book Jacob had found in the attic. Tanya looked up and waved, her innocent smile briefly breaking the tension in the room. "Hi," she said brightly. "Do you want to color with us?" One of the officers smiled faintly, but quickly masked it with a professional demeanor. "We're just here to make sure you're all okay," he said. The officers spoke with each child in turn, their questions gentle but probing. Jacob stood nearby, his hands clenched into fists to keep them from shaking. Mia, as always, was the most guarded. Her answers were brief, her tone cautious. But when one of the officers asked if she felt safe, her response was immediate. "Yes," she said firmly. "Jacob is taking care of us. Better than anyone else ever has." The officers exchanged a glance, and Jacob felt a flicker of hope, but as they left, their parting words were a sobering reminder of the battle ahead. "We'll be submitting a report to Child Services," one officer said. "You'll likely hear from them again soon." Jacob nodded, his face unreadable. "Thank you." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered street, an unexpected visitor arrived. Mrs. Harrison, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down, stood on Jacob's porch with a basket of freshly baked bread. Her face was lined with worry, but her eyes held a warmth that had been absent in so many of his other neighbors. "Jacob," she said softly, handing him the basket. "I've been meaning to come by." Jacob took the basket, his throat tightening. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison," he said. "I appreciate it." She glanced past him, into the house where the children were now sitting by the Christmas tree, their laughter faint but genuine. "They seem happy," she said. "And safe." "They are," Jacob replied, his voice firm. Mrs. Harrison nodded, her expression thoughtful. "People forget," she said after a moment. "They forget how much you've done for this town, how many children you've helped over the years." Jacob looked down, the weight of her words both comforting and painful. "It doesn't feel like they remember," he said quietly. She placed a hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Not everyone has forgotten," she said, "and some of us are still on your side." The next day, the crowd outside grew larger. A petition had started circulating, demanding that child services remove the children from Jacob's care. Flyers plastered on lampposts and shop windows read, "Protect our children. Demand answers from Jacob Daniels." But amidst the chaos, an ally emerged. Lisa McAdams, a young journalist for a smaller independent paper, arrived on the scene. Unlike her sensationalist counterpart, Lisa approached the situation with genuine curiosity and a desire for truth. She knocked on Jacob's door late in the afternoon, her camera slung over her shoulder. "I'm not here to attack you," she said quickly when Jacob opened the door. I think there's more to this story than what people are saying. And I want to tell it." Jacob hesitated, his instincts screaming to protect the children from any more scrutiny. But something in Lisa's eyes, a sincerity that had been absent in the others, made him pause. "All right," he said finally, "but only if the children agree." That evening, Lisa sat in the living room with Jacob and the children, her notebook open on her lap. She asked them gentle, thoughtful questions, listening intently as they spoke. Mia, ever the protector, was cautious at first, but gradually opened up. "People think he's weird," she said, her voice steady. "But he's the only one who cared enough to help us. Everyone else just looked the other way." Tanya chimed in, her small voice filled with unshakable certainty. "Jacob is nice. He makes us pancakes and lets us color." By the time Lisa left, the mood in the house had shifted. For the first time in days, Jacob felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth would finally be heard. Outside, however, the storm continued to rage. The whispers had turned into shouts, the accusations into demands. Jacob knew the battle was far from over. But as he sat by the Christmas tree that night, surrounded by the soft glow of lights and the quiet laughter of children, he reminded himself why he had taken them in. Because it was the right thing to do. Because someone had to. And no matter the cost, Jacob Daniels was willing to pay it. Allies in the shadows. The following morning, Brighton Hills awoke to an air of tension so thick it seemed to seep through the frost-covered windows of every home. Jacob Daniels' house was now the epicenter of a battle between fear and compassion. Outside, the crowd had swelled. Reporters, neighbors, and even strangers who had heard about the story gathered, their voices a cacophony of judgment, speculation, and thinly veiled malice. Inside, Jacob sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. Across from him, Mia stared out the window, her face a mask of quiet defiance. The other children huddled together in the living room, their laughter now subdued, replaced by an uneasy silence. "Why do they hate us?" Marcus asked, his small voice breaking the quiet. Jacob's chest tightened. "They don't hate you, Marcus," he said gently. "They just don't understand." Mia's sharp gaze shifted to Jacob. "They hate what they don't understand," she said, her tone cold. "That's what my mom used to say." Jacob's heart ached at her words, but before he could respond, a knock at the door startled them. He stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and opened the door to find Mrs. Harrison standing there, her breath visible in the cold morning air. "I brought you something," she said, holding out a thermos and a bag of freshly baked cookies. "Thought you and the children might need it." Jacob blinked, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison," he said, stepping aside to let her in. She hesitated, glancing at the growing crowd across the street. "I can't stay long," she said, her voice low. "But I wanted you to know you're not alone." Jacob's throat tightened. "That means more than you know." Mrs. Harrison nodded, her expression serious. "The town can be cruel," she said, "but not everyone here has forgotten who you are, Jacob. Some of us remember the teacher who stayed late to help struggling kids, the man who volunteered every Saturday at the library. And now, these children, they're lucky to have you." Her words were a balm to Jacob's weary soul. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. That afternoon, an unexpected voice joined the fray. Lisa McAdams, the young journalist who had spent the previous evening speaking with Jacob and the children, published her article. It was a far cry from the sensationalist pieces that had fueled the town's outrage. Instead, it was a heartfelt and detailed account of Jacob's kindness and the children's plight. In a world where indifference often reigns, Jacob Daniels chose compassion. These 9 children, cast aside by a system that failed them, have found safety and warmth in his care. Yet, rather than celebrate his generosity, we have allowed fear and suspicion to cloud our judgment. What does that say about us as a community? The article spread quickly, circulating through social media, and landing on the desks of editors at larger publications. It sparked heated debates, dividing the town into 2 camps: those who supported Jacob and those who believed he had ulterior motives. For the first time, the voices in his defense grew louder. By evening, Jacob's phone rang, a sound so rare it startled him. He answered hesitantly, unsure of what to expect. "Jacob, it's Pastor Morgan," came the familiar voice. "I just read Lisa's article, and I wanted to say, I believe you." Jacob exhaled, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Pastor. That means a lot. I also wanted to ask," the pastor continued, "if you'd be willing to bring the children to the church tomorrow. We're organizing a Christmas service, and I think it might help show the town who you really are." Jacob hesitated. The thought of exposing the children to more public scrutiny made him uneasy. But the pastor's suggestion carried weight. It was an opportunity to shift the narrative. "I'll think about it," Jacob said finally. "Thank you." That night, Jacob gathered the children in the living room. The small Christmas tree glowed softly, its simple decorations casting gentle shadows on the walls. He knelt before them, his voice calm but firm. "Tomorrow, we've been invited to the church," he said. "It's a chance to show people that you're not just faces in a window, that you're real children with stories and dreams." The children exchanged nervous glances. Maya spoke first. "What if they still hate us?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with fear. Jacob met her gaze. "Then we show them the truth," he said, "that you're brave and strong and deserving of every bit of kindness this world has to offer." After a moment, Mia nodded. "Okay," she said, "we'll go." The next morning, the walk to the church was like a gauntlet. The crowd outside Jacob's house had grown even larger, their stares piercing as he and the children made their way down the snow-covered street. But Jacob held his head high, his hand resting gently on Marcus's shoulder. The church was packed. News of the service had spread quickly, and even those who rarely attended had come, eager to witness the unfolding drama. At the front of the sanctuary, Pastor Morgan stood waiting, his kind eyes scanning the room. Jacob and the children entered quietly, their presence immediately drawing every gaze in the room. Whispers rippled through the crowd, but Pastor Morgan stepped forward, raising a hand to silence them. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady and warm. "Today, we're here to celebrate the true spirit of Christmas, a spirit of love, compassion, and understanding. And there's no better example of that spirit than what we've seen in Jacob Daniels. The room fell silent as the pastor gestured for Jacob to join him at the front. Jacob hesitated, his heart pounding, but Mia's small hand on his arm gave him the courage to move forward. These children, Pastor Morgan continued, are not a threat. They are not a scandal. They are children, innocent, vulnerable, and in need of our care. And Jacob has given them exactly that. For the first time, Jacob spoke. His voice was quiet but firm, carrying the weight of his conviction. I didn't take these children in for recognition or praise, he said. I did it because it was the right thing to do, because no child should feel unloved, especially at Christmas. The children, seated in the front pew, looked up at him with wide eyes. Even Mia, who rarely let her guard down, seemed moved. The service ended with a standing ovation, not from everyone, but from enough people to make a difference. As Jacob and the children made their way back home, a few neighbors approached them, offering kind words and warm smiles. The tide was beginning to turn. That night, as the children slept soundly for the first time in weeks, Jacob sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The battle wasn't over. He knew that. But for the first time, he felt like he wasn't fighting it alone. And that was enough to keep hope alive. A light in the darkness. The day after the church service, the town of Brighton Hills felt subtly different. Though the crowd outside Jacob Daniels' home had thinned, the battle was far from over. The judgment and whispers hadn't vanished, but they had softened, tempered by the voices of those who now stood in Jacob's defense. The children, however, remained wary. For all their smiles and laughter within the safety of Jacob's home, their guard was never entirely down. That morning, Jacob awoke to find Mia sitting at the kitchen table, staring intently at the letter from Child Services that lay open before her. Her small fingers traced the edge of the paper as if trying to make sense of the words. "They're coming back, aren't they?" she asked without looking up. Jacob poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her. "Yes," he said honestly. "They need to decide whether I'm allowed to keep you here." Mia's gaze shifted to him, her dark eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. "Why do they get to decide?" she asked. "Why can't we just stay?" Jacob leaned forward, his hands clasped around the warm mug. "Because the world doesn't always trust what it can't control," he said gently. "But we have to show them that what we've built here is worth fighting for." The knock came just after noon. Laura Harris and Richard Moore from Child Services stood on the porch again, their expressions a blend of professionalism and curiosity. Behind them was another figure, a woman Jacob didn't recognize. She was tall and stern, her sharp features framed by a sleek, dark coat. "I'm Marjorie Cole," she said, extending a hand. "I'm the regional director for Child Services." Jacob hesitated but shook her hand. "Please, come in." The trio stepped inside, their eyes scanning the house with practiced precision. Jacob noticed Marjorie's gaze linger on the children, who were seated around the coffee table, working on a puzzle. Maya stood protectively at the edge of the group, her arms crossed. "We'd like to conduct a formal evaluation," Marjorie said. "Speak with the children again, inspect the home, and, if you're comfortable, speak with you more extensively about your intentions." Jacob nodded. "Whatever you need." The interviews took hours. Each child was questioned separately in Jacob's small study, while Laura and Richard took notes. Marjorie examined every corner of the house, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She inspected the pantry, the bedrooms, the bathrooms, anywhere that might hold a clue about Jacob's ability to care for 9 children. When it was finally Jacob's turn, he sat across from Marjorie at the dining table, his hands folded tightly in his lap. "Mr. Daniels," she began, her tone measured. "This is an unusual situation. 9 children, all homeless, taken in by a single man living alone. You understand how this might raise concerns." Jacob nodded. "I do," he said. "But when I found them, they had no one. They were cold, hungry, and scared. I couldn't walk away." "And what's your plan moving forward?" Marjorie asked. Providing temporary shelter is one thing, but long-term care is another matter entirely. Jacob took a deep breath. I've already contacted the local community center about enrolling the children in school, he said, and I'm working on applying for foster care certification. I know it's not ideal, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to keep them safe. Marjorie studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You've given these children a lot, she said finally, but kindness alone isn't enough. They need stability, resources, and structure. They need love, Jacob countered, his voice steady. And I have more of that to give than most. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in hues of gold and gray, something unexpected happened. A knock at the door startled Jacob, and when he opened it, he found Pastor Morgan standing on the porch, flanked by Mrs. Harrison and two other neighbors holding baskets of food and supplies. We thought you could use some help, Pastor Morgan said with a warm smile. Jacob stepped aside, overwhelmed as they carried the baskets inside. Fresh produce, loaves of bread, warm blankets, and even a few toys filled the room. I don't know what to say, Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. You don't have to say anything, Mrs. Harrison replied, patting his arm. We should have done this sooner. As the neighbors worked to organize the donations, more people arrived. Some brought clothes, others books and games for the children. By the end of the evening, Jacob's living room was filled with more generosity than he'd ever imagined possible. Word of the community's support spread quickly, reaching even the most skeptical corners of Brighton Hills. The narrative began to shift, no longer driven solely by fear and suspicion, but by the undeniable proof of Jacob's kindness and the children's happiness. The final decision from Child Services came 3 days later. Jacob sat at the dining table with Marjorie, Laura, and Richard, his hands trembling slightly as he waited for them to speak. We've reviewed the case extensively, Marjorie said, her tone firm but not unkind. And while there are concerns about the long-term feasibility of this arrangement, we cannot ignore the care and stability you've provided these children. For now, they will remain in your care under supervised guardianship. Jacob exhaled, relief flooding through him. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marjorie held up a hand. This isn't a permanent solution, she said. You'll need to complete foster care certification and continue meeting our standards. But I believe you're capable of that. Jacob nodded, determination shining in his eyes. I won't let you, or them, down. Christmas morning arrived with a blanket of fresh snow and a sense of peace that hadn't been felt in weeks. The children awoke to find stockings filled with small gifts, each one thoughtfully chosen by Jacob and the neighbors who had rallied to help. Tanya squealed with delight as she unwrapped a doll, while Marcus marveled at the wooden train set he received. Even Mia, usually so guarded, allowed herself a small smile as she unwrapped a new journal and a set of colorful pens. Jacob watched them, his heart full. For the first time in years, his home felt alive, not just with laughter, but with hope. As the children played by the tree, Jacob stepped onto the porch, a cup of coffee in hand. Across the street, Mrs. Harrison waved from her window, and he nodded in gratitude. The crowd of onlookers had disappeared, replaced by the quiet hum of a town beginning to heal. Jacob turned back to the house, the sounds of the children's laughter wrapping around him like a warm embrace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this. He would fight for these children with everything he had, for as long as they needed him. Because that's what love does. It fights. It endures. And in the end, it changes everything. The strength of a promise. The rest of Christmas Day unfolded like a dream. Jacob's home, once so quiet and solitary, now echoed with the sound of children's laughter and joy. The warmth of the fire in the living room paled in comparison to the glow on their faces as they unwrapped small but meaningful gifts, scarves and mittens knitted by Mrs. Harrison, books donated by the library, toys brought by neighbors. Even Mia, who always carried the weight of responsibility, let herself relax. She sat on the floor with Marcus, showing him how to assemble a puzzle they had received. Her laugh, soft and fleeting, was a rare sound, but it filled Jacob with a sense of accomplishment. He had done something right, and for the first time in a long time, the world felt just a little kinder. Later that evening, as the children played, Jacob stepped outside to gather his thoughts. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and the cold air bit at his skin. He looked down the quiet street, now empty of reporters and onlookers. It was a strange sight, peaceful, almost serene. The chaos of the past few weeks had receded, leaving behind a stillness that felt fragile but precious. The creak of a door drew his attention. Mrs. Harrison stepped out onto her porch, wrapped in a thick coat. She waved him over, and he crossed the street to meet her. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with genuine concern. Jacob offered a small smile. "Better than I thought I would be," he admitted. "The decision from Child Services was a relief, but I know this is just the beginning." Mrs. Harrison nodded. "It is," she said, "but you're not alone anymore. The community sees you now, Jacob. They see what you've done for those children. And for some of us, it's a reminder of what Christmas is supposed to mean." Her words warmed him more than the fire ever could. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." She patted his arm. "You've always been there for others," she said. "It's about time someone was there for you." Inside, the children were settling down for the night, their small bodies nestled under blankets Jacob had arranged around the Christmas tree. He watched them for a moment, his heart full as they whispered and giggled before sleep took them. Mia, ever watchful, was the last to close her eyes, her head resting on a pillow Jacob had brought down from his bedroom. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. Jacob sat in his old armchair by the fire, staring into the flames as memories of the past few weeks played in his mind. The whispers, the accusations, the relentless scrutiny. It had been one of the hardest battles of his life, but it had also been one of the most rewarding. He thought about the future, about the challenges that still lay ahead. The certification process for fostering, the ongoing evaluations from Child Services, the questions that would inevitably arise. But he also thought about the children, their resilience, their laughter, their trust in him despite everything they had endured. They had given him a purpose he hadn't realized he was missing. As the fire crackled and the snow fell softly outside, Jacob made a silent promise. No matter what came next, he would fight for these children. He would give them the stability and love they deserved. He would ensure they never felt unwanted or forgotten again. By New Year's Eve, Brighton Hills had begun to change. The neighbors who had once whispered in judgment now greeted Jacob with warm smiles and offers of help. The children, once wary and guarded, had started to find their place in the community. They attended a small holiday party at the church, where Tanya dazzled everyone with her shy rendition of Silent Night, and Marcus made new friends over a game of checkers. Maya remained cautious, but even she began to open up. She sat with Pastor Morgan after the party, speaking softly about her dreams and fears. Jacob watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride. When they returned home that evening, Maya lingered by the front door as the other children went inside. She turned to Jacob, her expression unreadable. "You really mean it, don't you?" she asked. "Mean what?" Jacob replied. "That you'll keep us safe." Jacob crouched down to her level, meeting her gaze with unwavering certainty. "With everything I have," he said, "for as long as you need me." Mia studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Okay," she said, her voice soft but sure. "I believe you." Months passed, and Jacob's house became a home. The children settled into school, their lives slowly taking on a sense of normalcy. Jacob completed the foster care certification process, and while it wasn't easy, he met every challenge with determination. The community, once divided, rallied around him. Mrs. Harrison became a frequent visitor, often bringing freshly baked bread or a basket of vegetables from her garden. Pastor Morgan organized fundraisers to support the children's education, and even the local news shifted its tone, highlighting Jacob's story as one of hope and resilience. On the anniversary of that fateful Christmas, Jacob stood on his porch, stringing up the same warm white lights he had hung the year before. This time, he wasn't alone. Marcus and Tanya were helping untangle the cords, while Mia directed them with a mix of exasperation and amusement. As the lights illuminated the house, casting a soft glow over the snowy yard, Jacob felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The battle wasn't over, but they had made it through the worst of the storm. Inside, the children gathered around the tree, their laughter filling the house once more. Jacob watched them from the doorway, his heart full. In a world that had often felt cold and unforgiving, they had found warmth. They had found hope. They had found a family. And for Jacob Daniels, that was the greatest gift of all.